Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Sino-French War, 1884-1885. Now buckle up as we begin. In the humid jungles and ancient cities of Southeast Asia, two great powers stood on the brink of war. France, driven by imperial ambitions and the dream of a vast Indochinese empire, had been steadily expanding its influence in Vietnam since the 1860s. The Qing Dynasty of China, though weakened by internal strife and previous defeats to Western powers, still considered Vietnam a tributary state under its traditional sphere of influence. By 1883, tensions had reached a breaking point as French forces advanced deeper into Tonkin, the northern region of Vietnam, directly challenging Chinese authority and presence in the area. The roots of this conflict stretched back decades to France's gradual conquest of southern Vietnam, known as Cochinchina, beginning in 1858. By the 1870s, French merchants and missionaries had established a foothold, but their northern expansion into Tonkin brought them into direct confrontation with China's centuries-old tributary relationship with Vietnam. Chinese forces, known as the Black Flag Army under Liu Yongfu, had been fighting alongside Vietnamese forces against French encroachment since 1873. These irregular Chinese troops, veterans of the Taiping Rebellion, proved formidable guerrilla fighters in the difficult terrain of northern Vietnam. The situation became increasingly volatile as French military commanders on the ground pushed for aggressive action, while diplomats in both Paris and Beijing struggled to maintain peace through negotiations. On December 14, 1883, the powder keg exploded at the Battle of Son Tay, a fortified town northwest of Hanoi. French forces under Admiral Amédée Courbet launched a major assault against Chinese and Vietnamese defenders who had transformed the ancient citadel into a formidable fortress. The battle raged for 3 days as French Colonial Marines and Foreign Legion units stormed the walls under heavy fire from Chinese artillery and small arms. Despite fierce resistance from Liu Yongfu's Black Flag troops, superior French firepower and European military tactics eventually prevailed. The fall of Son Tay marked a significant escalation in the conflict, as it demonstrated France's commitment to ejecting Chinese influence from Tonkin entirely. However, the victory came at considerable cost, with hundreds of French casualties and growing concerns in Paris about the expanding nature of the campaign. Following the Battle of Son Tay, diplomatic efforts intensified as both nations sought to avoid full-scale war. In May 1884, Chinese representative Li Hongzhang and French negotiator François-Ernest Fournier signed the preliminary Treaty of Tianjin. This agreement appeared to resolve the crisis, with China recognizing French protectorate rights over all of Vietnam and agreeing to withdraw its forces from Tonkin within specified timeframes. France, in return, agreed to respect China's southern border and refrain from using language that might be considered humiliating to Chinese dignity. However, the devil lay in the details of implementation. Miscommunications, delayed troop movements, and conflicting interpretations of withdrawal schedules created numerous flashpoints. Local commanders on both sides, operating with poor communications to their distant capitals, continued to view each other with suspicion and maintained aggressive postures despite the diplomatic breakthrough. The fragile peace shattered on June 23, 1884, at the small border town of Bacla. A French column under Lieutenant Colonel Alphonse Duchesne, advancing to occupy positions supposedly evacuated by Chinese forces according to the Tianjin Agreement, encountered Chinese troops who had not yet received withdrawal orders. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, but shooting erupted when the French attempted to occupy a strategic bridge and customs post. Chinese forces, believing they were under unprovoked attack, responded with concentrated fire from prepared positions. The engagement quickly escalated as reinforcements arrived on both sides, transforming a minor incident into a significant battle. French casualties mounted as they found themselves outnumbered and caught in difficult terrain. News of the Bacla affair, as it became known, reached both capitals, and triggered a diplomatic crisis that would ultimately collapse the peace process entirely. The Bacla affair triggered a wave of outrage in Paris, where French politicians and press denounced what they perceived as Chinese treachery and violation of the Tonkin Agreement. Prime Minister Jules Ferry faced intense criticism for the diplomatic approach and came under pressure to respond forcefully to restore French honor. In Beijing, the Qing court was equally incensed by what they viewed as French aggression and bad faith. The war party at court, led by officials who had opposed any concessions to France, gained influence over the Guangxu emperor and his advisors. Both governments began mobilizing for wider conflict. France ordered additional naval squadrons to East Asian waters and reinforced its garrison in Tonkin, while China began moving regular army units toward the Vietnamese border and upgrading coastal defenses. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly as mutual accusations of treaty violations destroyed any remaining trust between the two powers. Admiral Amédée Courbet, commanding the French Far East Squadron, received orders to apply naval pressure on China while avoiding actions that might be construed as declarations of formal war. This delicate balance proved impossible to maintain. On August 23, 1884, Courbet's squadron entered the harbor of Fuzhou, home to the Fujian Fleet, one of China's most important naval bases. The French admiral demanded that Chinese naval forces remain neutral in any resumed fighting in Tonkin, while Chinese commanders refused to abandon their compatriots fighting the French. Tensions escalated as both fleets maintained battle stations in the confined waters of the harbor, with French ironclads facing Chinese cruisers and gunboats at point-blank range. Local Chinese officials attempted to mediate, but military commanders on both sides prepared for what appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. The standoff lasted several days, as both admirals awaited final instructions from their governments. At 2 p.m. on August 23, 1884, Admiral Courbet received the authorization he had been waiting for. The Battle of Fuzhou erupted with devastating suddenness as French warships opened fire at point-blank range on the surprised Chinese fleet. The modern French ironclads, with their rifled guns and steel armor, proved devastatingly superior to the older Chinese vessels. Within minutes, Chinese ships were ablaze and sinking throughout the harbor. The Chinese flagship, Yangwu, exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. Shore batteries attempted to respond, but French naval gunnery systematically destroyed the coastal fortifications. In less than an hour, the entire Fujian fleet had been annihilated with the loss of over 3,000 Chinese sailors and marines. French casualties were minimal. The one-sided nature of the victory shocked both nations and demonstrated the growing technological gap between Western and Chinese military capabilities. The destruction of the Fujian fleet marked the point of no return. Both governments abandoned any pretense of limited conflict and began mobilizing for total war. In China, the court declared a formal state of war against France and began coordinating military responses across multiple theaters. Chinese forces in Tonkin received orders to resume active operations against French positions, while coastal defenses from Canton to Shanghai were reinforced and modernized. French strategy evolved to include a comprehensive naval blockade of Chinese ports and coordinated land operations in northern Vietnam. However, the war's expansion brought new challenges for both sides. France's limited military resources were stretched thin across the vast distances of Southeast Asia and the Chinese coast, while China's technological disadvantages became increasingly apparent as modern French warships dominated coastal waters. Both nations began seeking international support and allies while preparing for what promised to be a prolonged and expensive conflict. While naval battles dominated headlines, the land war in Tonkin intensified with renewed ferocity. French forces under General Charles-Marie Le Bailly de Tillières launched operations to clear Chinese regular forces and Black Flag irregulars from key positions along the Red River Valley. The mountainous terrain of northern Vietnam proved ideal for guerrilla warfare. allowing Chinese and Vietnamese forces to mount devastating ambushes before melting back into the jungle. French colonial marines and foreign legion units found themselves fighting a frustrating campaign against an elusive enemy who refused to engage in conventional European-style battles. Supply lines stretched precariously through hostile territory, while tropical diseases took a heavy toll on French manpower. Chinese commanders Liu Yongfu and Tang Jingsong coordinated resistance efforts, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain and population to maximum advantage. The French advance slowed to a crawl as casualties mounted and reinforcements became urgently necessary. Admiral Courbet expanded French naval operations along the Chinese coast, seeking to pressure Beijing through economic warfare and strategic strikes. In October 1884, French squadrons began systematically attacking Chinese coastal installations and enforcing a blockade of major ports. The island of Formosa, Taiwan, became a particular focus as French forces occupied the Pescadores Islands and launched raids against Taiwanese ports. However, Chinese resistance proved more determined than expected. At Tamsui, French marines attempting to establish a permanent foothold were repelled by Chinese defenders under the command of Liu Mingchuan. The tropical climate and unfamiliar terrain took a heavy toll on French forces, while Chinese defenders showed remarkable tenacity in defending their homeland. French naval supremacy allowed them to control the seas and strike at will, but occupying and holding territory required more resources than Paris was willing to commit to what many still hoped would be a limited conflict. The winter of 1884–1885 brought a temporary lull in major operations, but both sides used this respite to reinforce their positions and plan new offensives. French reinforcements arrived in Tonkin, bringing total French forces to over 35,000 men, while new naval squadrons patrolled the Chinese coast with increasing effectiveness. The blockade began to impact Chinese commerce significantly, particularly in southern ports where foreign trade was most concentrated. In Beijing, the Qing government struggled with the financial burden of the war while attempting to modernize its military forces. Chinese commanders in Tonkin received additional regular army units and improved weapons, including modern artillery purchased from German suppliers. Both sides engaged in extensive diplomatic efforts to gain international support, with France seeking British and German approval for its actions, while China appealed to traditional allies and fellow Asian powers for assistance against Western aggression. Spring 1885 brought renewed French offensive operations as General Louis Brière de l'Isle launched a coordinated campaign to drive Chinese forces from their remaining strongholds in Tonkin. The key objective was Lang Son, a fortified border town that served as the primary Chinese base for operations in northern Vietnam. Chinese forces had spent months strengthening their positions, creating a complex of trenches, bunkers, and artillery emplacements that commanded the approaches to the town. The Battle of Lang Son began on February 13, 1885, as French colonial forces launched a series of coordinated attacks against the prepared Chinese positions. Despite fierce resistance and heavy casualties, French troops gradually gained ground through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Chinese defenders under General Pan Dingxin fought with remarkable tenacity, launching counterattacks that temporarily drove back French advances. The battle raged for weeks, as both sides committed their reserves in what became one of the largest engagements of the entire war. The fall of Lang Son on February 28, 1885, marked the high point of French military success in the land campaign. Chinese forces, after weeks of desperate resistance, were finally compelled to abandon their positions and retreat across the border into China proper. The victory opened the entire northern frontier of Tonkin to French control and effectively ended organized Chinese resistance in Vietnamese territory. However, the triumph came at enormous cost in French casualties and resources, leading to growing war weariness in Paris. General Brière de l'Isle's forces were exhausted and required extensive reinforcement before any advance into China could be contemplated. Chinese forces, while defeated, remained largely intact and began preparing defensive positions along their own border. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically in France's favor, but the ultimate goal of forcing Chinese recognition of French dominance in Indochina remained elusive as Beijing showed no signs of accepting a humiliating peace. Just as French fortunes appeared to be reaching their zenith, disaster struck at the Battle of Bangbo on March 28, 1885. A French detachment under Lieutenant Colonel Paul Herbinger, pursuing retreating Chinese forces, walked into a carefully prepared ambush in the mountainous border region. Chinese General Pan Dingxin had rallied his forces and, reinforced by fresh troops from across the border, launched a devastating counterattack that caught the overextended French completely by surprise. The engagement quickly turned into a rout as French forces, cut off from their supply lines and surrounded in unfamiliar territory, fought desperately to escape encirclement. Herbinger, panicked by the intensity of the Chinese assault and fearing complete annihilation, ordered a precipitous retreat that quickly degenerated into a disorganized flight back toward Langsun. The psychological impact of the defeat was enormous, transforming what had appeared to be decisive French victory into uncertainty and renewed Chinese confidence. The news of the Bangbo defeat reached Paris like a thunderbolt, triggering a political crisis that would ultimately topple the government of Jules Ferry. Opposition politicians, who had long criticized the war as expensive and unnecessary, seized upon the military reversal as evidence of fundamental strategic failure. Ferry faced a vote of no confidence in the Chamber of Deputies as public opinion turned sharply against the distant conflict. The defeat also emboldened Chinese negotiators, who had been under pressure to seek terms after the fall of Langsun. Emperor Guangxu and his advisors interpreted the French reversal as evidence that prolonged resistance might eventually force France to abandon its ambitions entirely. However, the military reality remained complex. While the Bangbo affair had been a tactical Chinese victory, French forces still controlled most of Tonkin and maintained naval supremacy along the Chinese coast. Both governments faced domestic pressure to end the costly conflict, but neither wished to appear weak in negotiations. While politicians in Paris debated, Admiral Courbet launched what would prove to be the final major French offensive of the war. On March 29, 1885, just one day after the Bangbo defeat, French naval forces attacked the Chinese fleet anchorage at Zhenhai, near Ningbo. This assault was part of a broader French strategy to intensify naval pressure on China's coast, while land operations in Tonkin remained stalemated. The battle demonstrated once again French technological superiority at sea, as modern ironclads systematically destroyed Chinese coastal fortifications and sank several vessels of the Nanyang fleet. However, Chinese resistance was more organized and effective than in previous engagements. Shore batteries, reinforced with modern German-supplied artillery, inflicted significant damage on French vessels before being silenced. The victory, while tactically successful, came at a higher cost than previous naval operations and failed to produce the strategic breakthrough that might have compensated for the land defeat at Bangbo. The death of Admiral Courbet on June 11, 1885, marked a symbolic end to French offensive operations. The popular naval commander, exhausted by months of continuous operations in the tropical climate, succumbed to dysentery while his squadron maintained the blockade of Chinese ports. His death was mourned throughout France and added to the growing sense that the war had achieved its objectives and should be concluded. By this time, both governments were actively seeking a face-saving conclusion to the conflict. The fall of Jules Ferry's government in March had brought new French leadership more inclined toward negotiation, while Chinese officials recognized that continued fighting would only bring further military defeats and economic disruption. Secret diplomatic contacts, maintained even during the heaviest fighting, began to coalesce around a framework that would allow both sides to claim victory while ending the destructive and expensive war. The Treaty of Tianjin, signed on June 9, 1885, officially ended the Sino-French War with terms that largely favored French objectives. China formally recognized the French protectorate over all of Vietnam, including Annam and Tonkin, effectively ending centuries of Chinese suzerainty over its southern neighbor. French commercial privileges were expanded, and China agreed to construct railway connections that would facilitate French trade with southern China. However, the treaty was carefully crafted to avoid language that explicitly humiliated China, allowing Beijing to present the agreement as an honorable compromise rather than a surrender. France agreed to respect Chinese territorial integrity and limit its presence to Vietnamese territory. The indemnity clauses were minimal, reflecting both sides' eagerness to end the expensive conflict. Most importantly, the treaty established French dominance in Indochina while preserving Chinese dignity, creating a framework for future peaceful relations between the two powers despite their recent conflict. The Sino-French War's conclusion marked a pivotal moment in East Asian history, establishing France as the dominant power in Indochina, while demonstrating China's continued vulnerability to Western military technology and tactics. Despite tactical victories like Bang Bo, China's overall defeat accelerated internal reform movements and highlighted the urgent need for military modernization. For France, the war secured the foundation of its Indochinese empire, though at enormous cost in lives and resources that contributed to domestic political instability. The conflict also established important precedents for future colonial warfare, showing how technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantages, but could not guarantee quick or easy victory against determined resistance. The war's legacy would influence regional politics for generations, setting the stage for further Western expansion in Asia while contributing to growing Chinese nationalism and reform movements that would ultimately transform the Middle Kingdom. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.